Naomi's ambition, Cindy's energy, Claudia's light. But why did Tatjana's story end in tragedy?
What was it like to do your first runway show?
Really scary. I was really scared. I didn't like it because I don't know, I'm shy. And
I don't think modeling is a fairy tale at all. If you're completely honest the way you go about in your life, then it just gives you back happiness.
It's all inspirational. I love to experience it. I love to give to it. I love to give it as it feeds me, because it feeds me in an incredible way. It's something that, you know, it's almost like a little fire inside of you burning for it.
You stop for a second when you hear that, right? Because we all know those 6 names that defined an era. Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Claudia Schiffer, Christy Turlington, Linda Evangelista, and yes, Tatjana Patitz. The legendary Big Six. To be part of that group meant standing at the very top of fashion history. But years later, Tatjana's name doesn't shine as brightly, even though she had a face filled with mystery and eyes that carried a depth no one else had. Think about it. How could one of the most glamorous icons of her generation fade into silence? And more importantly, what shadows were hiding behind her story? That's where it gets intriguing, because Tatjana's life shows us how fame and loneliness, beauty and fragility can exist side by side. But I'll give you the answer at the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for more videos like this. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. To Tatjana's birth, Tatjana Patitz was born on May 25, 1966 in Hamburg, Germany. Her father was German. Her mother had Estonian roots. So, in her blood, there was both that strict German discipline and a touch of Baltic melancholy. At a young age, the family moved to California. Now, you're probably picturing beaches, surfboards, sunshine, total freedom vibes, right? But for Tatjana, life wasn't that simple. She was shy, quiet, the kind of kid who blended into the background, the quiet one in the group. But here's the thing, sometimes silence hides the deepest emotions as a child. Her love for animals stood out. Horses, especially, were her passion. People who knew her back then said she could spend hours in a field just watching them. Nature was where she found peace. And maybe that's why, later in life, Tatjana stood apart from other supermodels. She carried this natural, unforced energy in her photos. It wasn't about striking some exaggerated pose. It was about something real funny enough. Modeling wasn't even her dream at first. Tatjana loved art, drawing, and music. She described herself as a little weird, a little lonely, and honestly, same girl. We've all been there. But life has a way of opening doors when you least expect it. In 1983, at just 17 years old, she entered the elite model look competition. Back then, this was the gateway to supermodel status. She didn't win first place, but she caught people's attention. And that detail matters, because Tatjana was almost always a little in the shadows. Yet even a shadow can be captivating. Elite's founder, John Casablancas, looked at her photos and saw something different, something secretive in her eyes. That secret became her trademark. Her early career took her to Europe, specifically Paris. And let's be real, Paris in the 80s was the capital of high fashion. For a young model, it was like being thrown into the Hunger Games of beauty. Imagine competing with Naomi Campbell's fierceness and Cindy Crawford's all-American charisma. Everyone was hustling for the spotlight. Tatjana, though, was quieter, more reserved. But Paris Vogue noticed her uniqueness in 1985. She landed the cover of Vogue Paris. She was just 19 years old. That cover was a turning point. Photographers didn't just see a pretty face, they saw mystery. And if there's one word to define Tatjana, it's mystery still. Even as she climbed the ladder of fame, she never turned into one of those loud, attention-hungry personalities. In interviews, she admitted, maybe being introverted was a disadvantage in this industry, but I couldn't be anyone else. That honesty was her strength, but also her weakness. Because the fashion world often rewards those who scream the loudest. 2 names changed her career forever: Herb Ritts and Peter Lindbergh. These legendary photographers saw something in Tatjana that others overlooked. Lindbergh, in particular, adored her natural aura. He believed she wasn't just beautiful, she was soulful. Later, when George Michael cast models for his iconic Freedom 90 Inches music video, Lindbergh pushed for Tatjana to be part of it. But hey, that's for the next chapter. No spoilers, yet what stands out in her early years is how different she was from the stereotype of a supermodel. Naomi was the rule-breaking diva. Cindy was the embodiment of the American dream. Claudia was the fairy-tale blonde goddess. But Tatjana, she was like a character from a novel, melancholic, authentic, and mysterious, which, in hindsight, makes the tragedy of her later years less surprising. Because sometimes silence is the loudest scream. Picture it, late 1980s. This young German-Estonian woman graces Vogue's cover in Paris. She's moving up the ladder slowly but surely. Yet deep down, she's still that shy, horse-loving girl from California. So here's the question, did her quiet nature give her strength, or did it make her fragile in an industry built on ruthless ambition? In the next chapter, we'll dive into her career's rise, the icons she worked with, and how she became part of the Big Six. But remember this, while the spotlight was shining. For Tatjana Patitz, the mid-1980s opened the doors to an entirely new world. Landing on the cover of Vogue Paris wasn't the end of the road, it was only the beginning. Because at that time, something big was happening in fashion, the rise of the supermodel. Before that, models were often anonymous faces behind the clothes. But by the late 80s, models were becoming as famous as movie stars. And Tatiana entered the scene right in the middle of this revolution. What set her apart from the others was that she didn't look like your typical beauty. Her features were unusual: high cheekbones, slightly wide-set eyes, and a gaze that pulled you in. People often described her as having more of an art house film face than a Hollywood one. Not just glamorous, but mysterious. That's why photographers like Peter Lindbergh saw her face as a canvas. Working with Tatiana wasn't about capturing a pretty picture, it was about telling a story. By the late 80s, Tatiana was walking the runways of Paris and Milan. Jean Paul Gaultier, Chanel, Versace, she was there. But here's the twist. Tatiana never stormed the stage the way Naomi Campbell did. Her walk was calm, elegant, almost gliding. Critics would say she didn't stomp, she floated. She wasn't a burst of power, she was a poem, but there was a paradox in that. Because during that same era, fashion was obsessed with boldness, flash, and spectacle. Tatjana remained true to herself, simple, serene, authentic. Now tell me, did that make her more special, or did it keep her in the shadows? That question would follow her entire career. Her Vogue cover opened doors. But her true breakout came with Peter Lindbergh's legendary black and white photo shoot in 1988. You've probably seen it. 6 women in crisp white shirts. No heavy makeup, no gimmicks, just raw beauty. Naomi, Linda, Christy, Cindy, Claudia, and Tatiana. That image wasn't just a photo, it was history. And it cemented Tatiana as part of the Big Six. Why did Lindbergh choose her, though? Because she had something the others didn't: silence. Her eyes told stories without saying a word. In an interview, Lindbergh once said, Tatiana wasn't just beautiful. She transmitted her soul into the photograph. That single line sums up her entire career. By the early 90s, Tatiana was everywhere. Chanel, Valentino, Donna Karan, Calvin Klein. The list goes on. But again, she was never the loudest. She became known as the quiet supermodel. And maybe that's exactly why she stood out in an industry built on noise then. 90 music video. Tatjana appeared alongside Naomi, Cindy, Christy, and Linda. That video wasn't just a pop culture moment, it was a global announcement. Supermodels have arrived. In just a few seconds of screen time, Tatiana left an unforgettable mark with her enigmatic presence. But here's the thing, unlike her peers, she never leaned into the media circus. Naomi made headlines constantly. Cindy launched TV shows and beauty brands. Claudia became the star of countless ads.
Tatjana, she kept her distance.
In interviews, she often said, I love the stage, but I don't crave attention. That choice gave her both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, she protected her peace. She wasn't drained by scandals or tabloid wars. On the other hand, it meant she didn't stay as deeply embedded in the public memory as the others still. Within the fashion world, Tatiana held a very special place. Karl Lagerfeld admired her face. Versace wanted her on the runway. Even Cindy Crawford once said in an interview, Tatjana was the most unique among us. We sparkled, but she had depth. During this rise, the media also started poking into her private life. Rumors linked her with Hollywood actors and musicians. But Tatiana never put her relationships on display. She stayed mysterious, even when everyone else was feeding the press. So by the early 90s,
Tatjana was climbing higher and higher.
But here's the million-dollar question: choosing silence, staying authentic, Keeping things private, was that the right path for a supermodel? Or was it the first sign of the fading that would come later? By the early 1990s, the word supermodel wasn't just fashion slang anymore. It was global culture. Naomi, Cindy, Claudia, Linda, Christy. Their faces were everywhere. Magazines, TV commercials, billboards, late-night talk shows. And standing quietly among this storm was Tatjana Patitz, the sixth member of that legendary Big Six. Let's be clear. Tatiana was never the loudest or the most hyped. She wasn't the one constantly in the tabloids or hogging every cover. But that didn't make her any less iconic. In fact, that's what made her unforgettable. While Naomi radiated ambition, Cindy embodied the American dream. Claudia was the glowing blonde goddess. Tatiana brought something else. Depth. Her peak years aligned with the golden era of fashion photography. Herb Ritts, Peter Lindbergh, Irving Penn, these weren't just photographers, they were cultural architects. And for many of them, Tatiana was a muse. Lindbergh famously said, "Tatiana was like a figure out of a painting." Photographing her felt like getting to know a character from a novel. One of her career-defining moments came in 1990, when Lindbergh shot that now iconic black and white cover for British Vogue. You know the one. The Big Six in crisp white shirts, minimal makeup, hair undone. No glitter, no spectacle, just raw beauty. That single image rewrote the rules of fashion. And Tatiana? She was the embodiment of that natural, effortless grace, of course. She also conquered the runway. Chanel, Versace, Donna Karan, Valentino, she walked them all. But her walk was different. Naomi stormed like thunder. Claudia glowed like a spotlight. Cindy radiated confidence. Tatiana, she glided. Critics said she didn't walk the runway, she floated across it. That's why some dubbed her the philosopher of the catwalk. Then came the campaigns. Calvin Klein with its stripped-back minimalism. Donna Karan's powerwoman chic. Chanel's timeless elegance.
Tatjana could morph into all of them without ever losing herself.
She wasn't boxed in by one look. She was a chameleon, but with soul. And of course, there was George Michael's Freedom. 90 video. That wasn't just a music video, it was a cultural earthquake. For the first time, supermodels weren't just wearing the clothes, they were the stars. Even in her short screen time, Tatiana left a mark. Cindy later admitted, in that video, Tatiana's moment was one of the strongest. She didn't need to say a word, her eyes did the talking. Here's where things get interesting though. While her peers capitalized on fame, Naomi with her media headlines, Cindy with her TV projects, Claudia with her ad campaigns, Tatiana chose a different path. She was selective. You wouldn't see her everywhere. But when you did, you remembered this choice mirrored the trends of the time. The early 90s were a strange mix of excess and simplicity. On one side, Versace's bold, sexy glamour. On the other, Calvin Klein's clean, minimalist lines. Most models fit one or the other. Tatiana, she could embody both. She could be the sultry Versace siren and the stripped-down Calvin Klein muse all in the same year. That versatility made her invaluable, but what really set her apart was who she was off camera. While others leaned into the rock star lifestyle, Tatiana stayed grounded. In interviews, she came across as shy, thoughtful, almost hesitant. Cindy Crawford would later say, in the 90s, we felt like rock stars. Meanwhile, Tatiana's vibe was, I was just doing my job. Big difference. Right, so the question lingers, did her quietness make her even more unique? Or did it slowly erase her from mainstream memory? At her peak, Tatiana was everywhere in the industry, but still somehow distant from the frenzy. Even in success, there was a sense of solitude yet inside the fashion world. Her uniqueness was undeniable. Karl Lagerfeld wanted her for Chanel. Donna Karan loved her strength. Herb Ritts said his photos of Tatiana captured pure melancholy. That's what made her different while others sparkled. Tatiana gave you a feeling her peak years were full of contradictions. She was at the very center of the supermodel phenomenon, yet she always stood slightly apart. She loved the stage, but she refused to play the fame game. She was both essential and elusive. And that duality was what made her unforgettable still. You can't help but wonder, did her silence make her story more tragic? Because while everyone else was fighting to be remembered, Tatiana seemed almost at peace with being forgotten in the next chapter. We'll see how that same silence, the very thing that defined her, began to turn into a curse. Scandals, fading opportunities, and a slow retreat from the spotlight. But for now, at her brightest moment in the 90s, Tatjana Patitz had already carved her place in history as fashion's quiet philosopher. By the mid-1990s, the age of the supermodel was still alive, but fashion was beginning to shift. Tatjana Patitz was still walking major runways and starring in campaigns, but something was different. Naomi, Cindy, Claudia, they were everywhere. Not just in fashion magazines, but on TV shows, in commercials, and all over the headlines. Tatiana, she stayed in the background, quietly working but not screaming for attention. Think about it. Christy Turlington had become the iconic face of Calvin Klein. Cindy Crawford was hosting MTV shows and building her empire. Naomi Campbell was dominating headlines daily. And Tatiana? She was still selective. That selectiveness was both her shield and her trap. Fame sometimes requires fighting to stay visible, and Tatiana never fought that battle. Her distance from the press slowly created a gap in her career. She rarely gave interviews, she didn't live in the tabloids. And by the late 90s, a new wave had arrived, Kate Moss and the heroin chic trend. This look was completely different from the glamorous energy of the Big Six. Suddenly, fashion wanted edgy, thin, waif-like models. Tatjana's classical beauty felt almost too timeless in this new era. Meanwhile, her private life sparked quiet curiosity. At times, she was rumored to be linked with Hollywood actors like Richard Gere, at others with musicians and artists. But unlike Naomi or Linda, her relationships weren't played out in public. Tatiana kept things private, which only added to her mysterious aura. But mystery has a double edge. It can protect you, or it can push you into obscurity. By the late 1990s, the golden age of the supermodel was fading. A new generation, Gisele Bündchen, Adriana Lima, Heidi Klum, was stepping into the spotlight.
Tatjana slowly pulled back.
She appeared less on runways, less in campaigns. Part of this retreat was the industry changing. But part of it was her own choice. In 2004, she gave birth to her son Jonah, who became the center of her life. In one interview, she said, "Fashion raised me, but my son completed me." That single line summed up her philosophy. Modeling was important, but motherhood was her true anchor. Still, stepping away came with challenges. In Hollywood and fashion, if you're not under the spotlight, people forget quickly. And by the 2000s, Tatjana's name wasn't being mentioned like it used to. Baity media narrative around her shifted too. Headlines read things like, "She's disappeared," or "A quiet retreat." Meanwhile, Naomi Campbell was still grabbing headlines, Cindy Crawford was expanding her brand, and Claudia Schiffer was signing major deals. Tatjana, on the other hand, was living quietly in California with her son, but here's where the story gets heartbreaking. That silence she chose, or maybe was forced into, eventually turned into isolation. Within the fashion industry, her name was only brought up in the past tense. A 90s icon, they said, but never today's star. And then came the health battles. Nobody knew it at the time, but Tatjana was facing her biggest fight, cancer. She didn't broadcast it, she didn't go public. She kept her struggle private, the same way she had lived much of her career. So the question is, was this silence truly her choice? Or was it imposed on her by an industry obsessed with youth and noise? Maybe it was both. What's clear is this: after shining as one of the brightest stars of the 1990s, by the 2000s, Tatjana Patitz was almost completely forgotten. Let me put it to you like I would to a friend. Imagine being part of the most iconic group in fashion history, the Big Six. You're on the most famous magazine covers, in one of the most legendary music videos of all time. And then, a decade later, no one talks about you. That's the tragic reality Tatjana lived, and no, the tragedy didn't end there. In the next chapter, we'll talk about her quiet battle with cancer, her final days, and the heartbreaking end to her story. Because Tatjana Patitz lived her life in silence, and even her goodbye was silent. For Tatjana Patitz, the 2000s marked a quieter chapter of life. She was no longer under the blinding spotlight of global fashion. Instead, she built a slower, more grounded existence in California, raising her son Jonah, spending time near the ocean, riding horses, and surrounding herself with nature. Fame no longer defined her. Peace did, but as we all know, life doesn't always follow the script we imagine. By the early 2020s, Tatiana faced a battle few knew about. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer. True to her nature, she kept this fight private. No dramatic press statements, no public appearances to talk about her pain. She chose silence just as she always had during this time. Her son Jonah was her anchor. Those who knew them described their bond as unbreakable. Motherhood had become Tatiana's proudest role. She had once said, "Fashion raised me, but my son completed me." That quote wasn't just poetic, it was her truth. Even in her hardest days, she found peace in knowing she had raised him with love, but her battle was short. On January 11, 2023, Tatjana Patitz passed away at just 56 years old. The news shocked the fashion world. Many had no idea she was even sick. Suddenly, headlines read, "Tatjana Patitz has died." And just like her life, her farewell was quiet tributes poured in. The Peter Lindbergh Foundation shared a heartfelt message honoring one of his greatest muses. Cindy Crawford wrote, "Tatjana's presence was always calming. Sharing the stage with her was an honor," Naomi Campbell posted. "She was quiet, but she left a mark in all of our hearts, even in death." Tatiana's silence spoke volumes. Her passing reminded everyone that supermodels weren't just about glamour, scandals, or headlines. Tatiana's story showed that true strength can exist in quietness. She never screamed for attention, but somehow she was unforgettable. So, what was her legacy? Tatjana Patitz will forever be remembered not only as part of the legendary Big Six, but also as the face of natural beauty, depth, and quiet grace. Look at her photos today, and you'll still feel something, a kind of melancholy, a kind of poetry. She wasn't just a model. She was an emotion even now. When you flip through old magazines or watch those classic fashion shows, you can sense her difference. She wasn't always the most talked about, but she was often the most deeply felt. That's why her story carries both tragedy and wisdom. She showed us that to shine, you don't always have to be the loudest voice. Sometimes silence can make you timeless. And let's be honest, doesn't her story make you stop and think? Isn't it a reminder that fame, money, headlines, they fade, but authenticity, love, and human connection last forever? For Tatiana, her son Jonah was her true legacy. The greatest accomplishment of her life, her death, also symbolized something bigger. For those who lived through the supermodel era of the 90s, it felt like a curtain closing. Naomi, Cindy, Claudia, they're still here, still present in the media. But Tatiana's quiet goodbye made us realize that even legends are not immune to time in the end. Tatjana Patitz left us two things: unforgettable images etched into fashion history, and a life lesson about the power of silence. And maybe that's why her story is both tragic and beautiful, because the quiet ones, they're often the ones we remember the most.